just have a quick recap on this idea of the mental revolution in South Africa. So Steve Biko said, being black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being black is a reflection of mental attitude. And what Steve Biko was advocating here is the idea that anybody can have this perspective of liberation, and this liberation needs to be inclusive of all people in society rather than just a select few or specific races and so forth. And it's about being empowered by the idea of being black. It's not just about skin colour, it's about identity, it's about ideas, it's about what was coined at the time a mental revolution, freeing your mind from the shackles of oppression and self-hatred and self-doubt and inferiority complexes. So you've already looked at this idea of what is mental revolution, so I'm just going to go over it a little bit more, because the inquiry that we're focusing on at this moment is how far did a mental revolution render state retaliation useless in 1970s South Africa? So that is from the interpretation of Gail Gerhardt, who argues that once those African minds were freed in South Africa, there was no way that oppression could be reinstated. Nothing that the apartheid government could have done would have basically put Africans into a position of compliance within the South African system. So it makes that any state retaliation useless, because no amount of force would ever see black Africans going back to the system that was set before them before. And the power of this idea is it's about removing this idea of non-whites. So whites, as was mentioned in the podcast, were the people who had status, they had an identity, they had something to stand and rally behind, whereas anybody else was just not white. They were the other. So there was no identity in being the other. There is no identity in being non-white, because even that is attached to the identity of whiteness, and it's about not meeting that criteria of rightness. So by taking back this term and saying we are not non-whites, we are black, it's about harbouring and creating and rallying behind their own identity. And it's so essential that the mind is freed before anything else. And that is because if you look at the way that South Africa was built, the way that apartheid was constructed, it is very much a system about trying to put Africans into a system of servitude and trying to argue that that is just the way it is because Africans just aren't as civilized as white people. They couldn't handle, as Vivud said, the same industry, the same culture, and the same access to society as white people could. And this is something that wasn't just put in government speak, it was something that was a lived experience for black people in South Africa. So if you have a look at Soweto Township, which is just outside of Johannesburg, just look at the nature of society that people were living in. So you can see overcrowding, you can see just poorly constructed houses made out of corrugated iron and so forth. So the whole system, the whole life that they're living is one of poverty and hardship. And then they go to work in Johannesburg, which is why the townships are there, because people in Johannesburg needed black labour. That included going into Johannesburg's suburbs, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right. And look at the difference between these two pictures. The people who were living in Soweto would be going into these suburban areas, cleaning these houses, working in these areas, and feeling, okay, so this is what the white person gets, this is what the black person gets. And it's hard for that not to be internalized and start to think that this is what the white person deserves and this is what the black person deserves. And that's what consciousness is. It's about removing this, and it's about understanding that you're not poor, you're not oppressed because you're poor, you're oppressed because you're black. And it's about understanding that your life is different because of the colour of your skin, and it's not because you deserve it, it's because the system has oppressed you in that same way. And that's that understanding, the understanding that the system is constructed to oppress you. And black consciousness is about empowering the people to understand that they actually deserve more than that. And that's the difference between the sort of two areas of Johannesburg and Soweto, and this idea that people are living with this inferiority complex. So Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement is about inspiring people to understand that they deserve more than this. So in terms of the roles of whites in resistance, you have two different kind of points of views on this. You have Sobukwe talking about black Africans liberating themselves, inspired by Lemdi, who said Africa is a black man's country, and argued that the ANC should be a black nationalist movement. Then you kind of have this other view, a more sort of liberal view, which is multiracialism, and saying, hey, we can all just work together. So in terms of black consciousness, where would they fit? Would they fit with this idea of multiracialism, or would they fit in this idea of black liberation through black people? And obviously, as you can see from Biko's comments here, it's in line with the Sobukwe idea. So a black man should be more independent and depend on himself for his freedom, and not take it for granted that someone would lead him to it. The blacks are tired of standing at the touchlines to witness a game that they should be playing. They want to do things for themselves and all by themselves. So important. Because this idea then that white people are playing the game to help black people is ridiculous. Because it's this idea, it's still the same idea, this white saviour complex, it's still the same idea as apartheid, it's just in a nicer format, saying that you're not worthy of liberating yourself, you're not able to, just let the white guy step in and do it for you. We don't want it to be too violent. So there's the limits of that, in the sense that it's about making it so that black people need white people to free them because they're like children and can't do it themselves, which is not going to help free the minds of Africans at all, is it? It's just going to reinforce that idea of white superiority. But also, the idea as well is, if you've got a white liberal trying to advocate for black rights, they're not going to be doing that at the expense of their own position in society. They'll always be kind of halfway committed to the struggle because they've not experienced the struggle. They can't understand the struggle in the same way. So it means that the movement will not be carried to its full potential and to what needs to be fully carried. So it's really important. Malcolm X actually made a really good point about white liberals and white sort of extremists, and he said, with the white extremists, the white racist, they are the wolf. You see their teeth, you see they're going to attack you. White liberals, so because you can see they're going to attack you, you can prepare yourself. White liberals, however, are the fox. They smile at you, and they're showing you their teeth, but it looks like they're smiling, it looks like they're being friendly, but they're going to eat you all the same. So it's this idea then about kind of with white people, it's not saying they can't be involved in the resistance, but it's about saying that white people need to kind of have a moment of self-actualization, understanding their role in the oppression of black people, and being able to accept that they're not the experts on this issue, that they should, if anything, be on the sidelines supporting and cheering black consciousness rather than trying to lead and advocate the change themselves, because they do not understand in the same way that the people who are experiencing the oppression do. So the issue then of non-racialism is, as Biko just put it really well, and I probably should just let him say it instead of rambling on, but they are claiming a monopoly on intelligence and moral judgment, and setting the pattern and pace for the realisation of the black man's aspirations. So that's ridiculous, this idea that white liberals feel like they can decide the pace of change for black Africans because they believe they are morally superior. It's ridiculous. They want to shy away from all forms of extremism, condemning white supremacy as being just as bad as black power. And now that is such a great point, because this idea of being anti-extremism is actually quite an extremist view, because if you're going to support the status quo and advocate for gradual change, you're still representing the existing extremism in society, the existing racisms and so forth. Black power and white supremacy are two different things, because black power is not about taking power away from other people, it's about empowering the people, it's about empowering black people who have been oppressed. And because that oppression has been state-sponsored and state-constructed for so long, you need to have a whole movement created towards a positive education to free black minds. So Gerhardt also mentions other factors in this, and one of the factors that she mentions is this idea of Southern Africa and what's going on in the 19th centuries, in the 1970s. So the title for today is How did developments in southern Africa contribute to liberating black South African minds? And you can see this picture here is it's a mural from Mozambique, and it's a mural representing the social change that happened in Mozambique in the 1970s. So if you have a look at this source, so this is source 1, what does it reveal about South Africa's geopolitics? And if you look around South Africa, so geopolitics is the politics of the geography, the politics of the situations around South Africa. So you've got on the left, Southwest Africa, occupied by South Africa. You've got Angola, which is ruled by the Portuguese. You've got Botswana, which is independent. You've got Mozambique, occupied by the Portuguese. You've got Rhodesia, which is white rule. And you can see here, all around South Africa, there is a buffer zone. There's a really important word to use, so write down that key word. All around South Africa, there is a friendly buffer zone. There are states around South Africa which are white people ruling over black Africans. And this justifies South Africa's position on apartheid. It justifies South Africa's white rule. And it kind of just creates this notion for the people within these countries too, that this is just the way it is. It's just the way it is. You've got white people ruling over black people. And you can see in Zambia, the ANC used that as a base in order to do guerrilla attacks. Although that's only going to be in Rhodesia, it's going to be harder to get from Zambia to Rhodesia to South Africa. So that buffer zone also protects them from guerrilla attacks around South Africa too. Something though changes. So what is it that changes when looking at source 2 that shows that white rule is going to be threatened in South Africa? And those changes are the independence of countries around South Africa. So you have Mozambique and Angola gain their independence, particularly after the fall of Salazar, the Portuguese dictator, who had ruled over Portugal, tried to keep his empire intact as well, and he actually made it illegal to criticize Portuguese exploration. He made it illegal to criticize the Portuguese Empire, constantly reinforced the value of empire to the Portuguese people, which is why their sort of take on history at the moment is so complicated. So the Portuguese colonies gain their independence. You also have Zimbabwe, so formerly called Rhodesia, gains independence too. So now South Africa doesn't have its white buffer zone in the same way. So its moral justification for what it's doing, although it was thin and ridiculous, did actually wither away in the 1970s. And the impact on this on the minds of people in South Africa is really, really important, because they're seeing their neighbours are getting independence, their neighbours are overthrowing white rule, and that's encouraging. It's saying that you're worthy of doing the same. So between 1974 and 80, you have the end of white rule in Mozambique, Angola, and Rhodesia. And that's so crucial in exacerbating calls for freedom in South Africa. This is definitely a major trigger cause in getting people to call for liberation from white rule. So this is the continued winds of change and the continued fall of empire in Africa. So what happened then is white South Africa is nervous about this, and what they end up doing is they strengthen their armed forces, so the South African Defence Force, and they essentially constantly try to undermine the revolutions in those neighbouring countries. So they do border raids on Mozambique, trying to undermine the revolutionaries there. They try to fund the counter-revolutionaries in Angola, in Rhodesia, so constantly encouraging civil wars in these countries. And by prolonging these wars and conflict, it means that these brand new states are weak. They need to be focusing on rebuilding infrastructure in their country, but instead they're occupied in a costly war with South Africa, the South African Defence Force. So it's about weakening their neighbours through secret support to their rivals. So South Africa actually is doing this to try and maintain its white buffer zone and trying to regain it. But interestingly, this ends up really financially weakening South Africa, because as you now know, those countries still exist today. So South Africa ends up investing so much money into these wars that it's even going to struggle to maintain control in its own country, and it gets quite expensive. So Biko said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So that is because if your if your mind is oppressed, you don't think that you deserve freedom. If you don't feel that you deserve freedom, you won't fight for freedom. And that's why the mind is so important. It's the first point of a revolution, is about raising consciousness and making it so that people understand their oppression and understand that there is an alternative and that they can fight and win that alternative. It's the first step before any planning of wars and revolutions and so forth. So these developments in South Africa revolutionize African minds. So you have these developments going on, but then you also have this idea of black consciousness merging with that to say, look, we can do the same thing in South Africa. And I think this awakening is really represented in this student here. So I apologize, I'm probably going to say the name wrong. So Tisti Mashini. So you start to have mass protests going on in South Africa. So when Mozambique gets its independence, 1,200 people in one of the most oppressive countries of the time, 1,200 Africans march on the street to celebrate Mozambique's independence. So that's incredibly brave. So think about how successful the apartheid regime had been in the 1960s in stifling oppression. You have here people going out and marching publicly, condemning apartheid for the first time in a decade. And the student I mentioned, he offers his graduation speech attacking the poor funding of African universities and inequalities in society, partly sparked by the liberations movements in southern Africa. He ends up being expelled, and a lot of students end up being expelled because of their actions in this. And they end up, like him, teaching in Soweto. So Soweto, because of the further oppression that they face, particularly with the teaching in Afrikaans, it ends up becoming a hotbed of revolution, with people like him going there and teaching there and kind of just raising consciousness in their students, but also in this wider context and being able to inform them about other things which are going on. So what you're going to do then is, obviously you've written down notes from this, but go on the homework doc, which I've posted in Google Classroom, and then just complete the tasks on there. Thanks, guys.